Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. 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 I think we're ready. We're ready to start the second session called The Rebellion and Beyond. There are two speakers. Hello. Order. Order. I've been dying to say that for the last year. Anyway, welcome to the second session, which is called the Rebellion and Beyond. This session will be chaired by Father Tony Gahan, who is again no stranger to the school. Tony is from North Kerry. Listowel, is that North Kerry? Okay. All right, it's from Listowel, the capital of North Kerry, I'm told. So, in any event, he's been a great attendant of the school over the years. He's a very distinguished author, priest of the Archdiocese of Dublin, but also a prolific author, primarily of historical works. He's written books, 32 books, I think, at the last time. Is that right, Father Tony? And he's written books on Austin Stack. He has written books on Senator Johnston, and he's written the EVP book on Thomas O'Donnell, A Political Odyssey, which is the subject of the first talk this afternoon. He's also past president of Irish Pen, I know. He's been very involved with the founding members, I think, of the Listowel Writers' Week. So he's everything. Like God, he is everything and everywhere. So we welcome Father Tony to introduce our two speakers for the next session. And again, he's under strict instructions to finish by 1 o'clock. At which point, again, as I said this morning, the library will be closed. Those of you who want to come back in the afternoon and who have already registered, let me see if I can get this little, you know, those little bookmarks you were given this morning, just simply to use those when you're coming in and you can come straight in. But those of you who have not registered for Seamus Mallon's interview this afternoon, please register. Those of you who have already registered, you show the bookmark and just walk in. So, Father Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurice, for your kind remarks. Welcome to our second session this afternoon, my dear friends. And at the very outset, I must say how much I enjoyed the lectures at the first session. They were absolutely wonderful. Now we have two speakers for this session. The first speaker is Dr. Martin O'Donoghue. He will talk about the career of Tom O'Donnell, one of Kerry's MPs between 1900 and 1918. He will also discuss his distinctive contribution to politics and public debate after independence. His first book, The Legacy of the Irish Parliamentary Party in Independent Ireland, is to be published by Liverpool University Press, and we wish him every success with that publication. Our second speaker is Professor Terence Dooley. His book, The Irish Big House in a Time of Revolution, is a classic on the subject. He is the director of the Centre for the Study of Historic Irish Houses and Estates at the University of Maynooth. He is also the author of a number of many publications on the cognate subjects on social and political history of Ireland, including The Decline of the Big House in Ireland in 2001, and The Decline and Fall of the Dukes of Leinster in 2014. So now it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. O'Donoghue to address us.
Thanks very much, Father. Thanks very much, Father, and thanks to Maurice and the committee for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here alongside a lineup of fantastic speakers. So, last October, the Plaid Cymru MP, Liz Saville-Roberts, became the first MP since 1901 to address the House of Commons in the Irish language. And the Welsh MP was speaking in the context of an Irish Language Act for Northern Ireland at the time. But I think, if I can say this as an O'Donoghue, I'm afraid, with no Kerry connections, there remains relatively little known or written, perhaps outside of Kerry, apart from Father Gahan's very fine biography, of the last speaker to address the House of Commons in Irish, Thomas O'Donnell. So, as you can see here, Liz Saville-Roberts and Father Gahan's fine book, and there's a copy of which just resting under my paper here today. So, as I say, in this time allowed, I want to look at the post-independence career of O'Donnell, to look at not just O'Donnell as a committed and energetic MP for West Kerry, who addressed his constituents' needs in the Commons on land issues, on the language, where he was instrumental in making Irish a matriculation subject for the National University of Ireland in 1908, and a strong backer too of Redmond's support for enlistment in 1914, but as somebody who made a distinctive contribution to post-independence Ireland, and to look at in the context of the legacy of the Irish Parliamentary Party from 1922 onwards. So I want to look at how he adapted to the vastly changed circumstances of the Free State, his efforts to lead a revival of the old Irish Party in the mid-1920s, and indeed his accommodation to the De Valera-led government of Fianna Fáil in the 1930s. And hopefully that this will highlight the varieties of Irish Party legacy, as well as looking at evolutions in political opinions and loyalties, but also the different ways in which we can look at Irish Party opinion before independence, but also political opinions since independence in the context of politics, Anglo-Irish relations, and also social and cultural issues. O'Donnell withdrew from a parliamentary contest in West Kerry in 1918, along with a lot of other former Irish Party MPs. And in the years afterwards, like a lot of his former colleagues, he didn't enter politics. He concentrated on personal and business matters. He moved to Dublin in 1921, but he didn't necessarily shy away completely from public debate. He was critical of aspects of the War of Independence. He was critical too of Joe Devlin and Northern Nationalists cooperating with Sinn Féin at that time. And he joined and took part in a lot of gatherings and clubs that would have been associated with the Irish Party. So the Irish Party was reduced to just 6 seats in the island of Ireland in 1918, but it still retained over 200,000 voters, which is probably equivalent to the first preference vote of Fianna Fáil in 2011 or Fine Gael back in 1943 and 44, and a lot of the networks and clubs still remained. So there were the Ancient Order of Hibernians remained strong in Ulster, but also in urban centres, and O'Donnell addressed AOH rallies in Antrim and Armagh in 1923 and 24, where he urged Northern MPs to take their seats in Stormont. He also became a member of the National Club, which was a small social club of a lot of middle-class men in Dublin from May 1923 onwards, and he played an active role in efforts to commemorate John Redmond and Willie Redmond. So in 1924 and 25, there were commemorations of John Redmond in Wexford that attracted over 20,000 people. And indeed in Ennis, there were crowds of over 10,000 heard Tom O'Donnell give an oration in memory of Willie Redmond. And at some of these occasions, particularly it must be said at the National Club in Dublin, O'Donnell gave lectures on Free State finance. And he was often quite critical of Free State policy in relation to taxation. He felt government expenditure was too high. And he was joined at these clubs and networks by those who would have been active in the Irish Party. Not least Captain William Redmond, John Redmond's son, seen here in his British Army uniform during the war, but also John Dillon, Joe Devlin, and other former MPs and former councillors. On one such famous occasion, he gave a lecture in the National Club on Free State finance. It was followed by a vote of thanks by John Dillon, which became infamous for his attack on the Free State, attacking the conduct of the Civil War, Free State finance, and indeed highlighting a remaining bitterness between some members of and supporters of the old Home Rule movement and those who had supported the treaty settlement. While this showed some, as I say, bitterness or discord, it also undoubtedly reflected an atmosphere where some thought old nationalists, as they were sometimes called, or the old Irish Party, could be revived. And the reluctance to find an easy accommodation with the Free State was also a companion of the number of politicians who entered the Dáil, particularly from 1923 onwards, who, coming from Home Rule backgrounds, were slow to accept a new party label. So I just look at a table here of independent TDs. This is from my book, which Father Gahan mentioned. If you look at independent TDs in the early Dáils, a number of them would have had some links back to the Irish Parliamentary Party, and they would have been slow to join the newer parties. So former MPs, for example, like Alfie Byrne is the first one to enter the Dáil in 1922, but also James Cosgrave in Galway, Redmond's son himself. And even where they're not former MPs, what you do also notice is they're former councillors or former poor law guardians who mightn't be as explicitly associated with the Home Rule movement, would have been prominent local politicians before independence, and they sometimes make their way into the National Parliament. There quite simply are more seats available for the Dáil in the 1920s than there would have been for Irish constituencies in the Commons before 1918. So, with the growth particularly of the Redmondite commemorations, there was talk from the mid-1920s of an attempt to revive the Irish Party. Redmond would be pivotal to any movement, particularly the resemblance he bore to his father and the value of the Redmond name. But as Father Gahan has shown, a lot of the drive and the initiative with the movement was Tom O'Donnell's. John Dillon and other ex-MPs retired completely into private life, but O'Donnell had showed initiative through his speeches and through writing to the press. In fact, as early as May 1926, O'Donnell was conducting informal discussions with former activists and politicians. And in June that year, he organised a meeting in Dublin in terms of getting former MPs and activists together with a view, as he said, to securing representation in the public life of the country. Bolstered by the success of Redmond at anniversaries and encouraged by the continued political flux in the Free State too, it must be said, where anti-treaty Sinn Féin still weren't taking their seats up until 1926, of course, and Cumann na Gael were attracting criticism from farmers' groups and others on some of the same lines that O'Donnell's lectures had touched on. Redmond and O'Donnell launched the Irish National League Party in September 1926, to much fanfare and large crowds, and to a lot of the pomp and ceremony that we might have associated with the Redmondite anniversaries of previous years. And sorry, if we go back there, we can see an image there of Redmond and O'Donnell conducting their early meetings in Leinster, around Leinster House, where immediately they had two TDs in James Cosgrave, the former MP for Galway, and Captain Redmond from their early stages. However, although the League enjoyed initial success, it soon found itself at the mercy of political developments outside its control, as well as some of the difficulties perhaps that we've associated with smaller parties both then and ever since. It faced problems about its identity, and it faced a fairly obvious initial contradiction about whether it was a new party or whether in fact it was just a revival of the old party. The name National League was an echo of Parnell's movement of the 1880s, and while O'Donnell would have called it a new party and Redmond would have said the same, in the early stages O'Donnell in particular was consulting John Dillon on a lot of policy and strategy. And indeed its initial launch too had a lot of echoes of the old parliamentary party. Some of its pamphlets and leaflets referenced John Redmond and Charles Stewart Parnell. It invoked the slogan of God Save Ireland. It was noticeable that the old green flag with the golden harp was more visible than the tricolour at its initial meetings. And even the membership cards for the new party were actually leftover green cards associated with the old United Irish League that were reused 9 years later. So it faced this identity crisis from its very beginning about whether it was a new party or an old party. And it could be rather Edwardian in its worldviews in other ways too. So for example, at an early stage it alienated Mary Sheehy Kettle, who was pictured in Yvonne's presentation earlier, by not involving women in its initial meetings. They then invited her to chair a meeting of the party in Rathmines, which she declined. And although no post-1922 party was particularly strong in women's representation, increasingly the National League began to appear as a cadre of the old party veterans, which heightened a sense of continuity with the older party. It did publish policy documents, and it outlined policies on education and indeed support for rural areas, and tried in some ways to muscle in on the territory of both Labour and the Farmers' Party. But a lot of the platform speeches, particularly by O'Donnell, and he was probably a more active canvasser and campaigner than Redmond in many ways, were more or less boiled down to criticisms of government expenditure, anti-partitionist speeches, and indeed complaints which were common among former Home Rulers. The Cumann na Gael were ex-Republicans masquerading as a law and order party. The League did make one distinctive stand in that it stated its opposition to the teaching of compulsory Irish in schools. But this was backfired in many ways because obviously it flew in the face of O'Donnell's previous support for the language, and it also was criticised among its own supporters, particularly members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in Donegal who would have been native speakers. So this was something the National League tried to quickly back away from. It sought to position itself as a constitutional nationalist party in the tradition of the old Irish Parliamentary Party. But the political situation was clearly different in the 1920s, with new parties and party fragmentation with the proportional representation system as well, a very different situation than had obtained when Parnell or Redmond led united national parties. So you had Labour and the Farmers' Party representing sectional interests, as the old Home Rulers might have called them. You had Cumann na Gael setting itself up as a constitutional nationalist party, and indeed from 1926 onwards you had De Valera's new Fianna Fáil party. O'Donnell, for his part, thought that perhaps the National League could absorb or form some kind of alliance with the Farmers' Party of this period as a kind of a consolidation of the old Land League legacy. But the Farmers' Party was quite split among different political loyalties at that time, and ultimately it seemed that the greatest proportion of it was favourable, or at least supportive of the government. So the Farmers' Party remained independent, but supported the government. The National League also tried to draw on lobby groups that would have been associated with the Irish Parliamentary Party, and they had representatives from licensed vintners and grocers at their early meetings. But none of these supporters, although on the face of it would seem valuable, none of them seemed to be valuable enough to provide the National League with the kinds of funds it needed to compete with, particularly Cumann na Gael and its new canvassing techniques at that time, or indeed Fianna Fáil, which was tapping into funds from supporters in the United States. In spite of all this, though, and in spite of the fact that some of the bullish statements by O'Donnell and Redmond might have led people to think that they were aiming for government, in the June 1927 elections, the League still did quite well. So, you can see there that of its 30 candidates, 9 were ex-MPs, 12 were ex-councillor guardians, 2 were former party candidates. So there was a strong overlap with the old Irish Party. But they won 8 seats. And on the second table there you can see the areas where they polled the strongest first preference. And there was a strong correlation between areas where the Irish Party would have done best in 1918 and where the National League would have done best in 1927. So they topped the poll in Louth with over 26% of the vote, and Louth was a constituency where the Irish Party were only defeated by Sinn Féin by a narrow margin in 1918. Similarly, Captain Redmond won a seat in Waterford, they won a seat in Wexford. They ran a very strong campaign in Monaghan, although they didn't win a seat. And in some other areas they managed to win seats with a smaller vote, but thanks in some ways to the larger multi-seat constituencies like Galway, where James Cosgrave and Willie Duffy ran, and Duffy was eventually elected on something like the 19th count in a 9-seater constituency. O'Donnell didn't actually win a seat. He contested Clare, hoping to capitalise on Willie Redmond's old base there, but the legacy of Irish Party support wasn't really as strong there as it had been in the border areas or in the southeast. But he remained co-leader of the party with Redmond, and after the election, with Cumann na Gael having had a bad election, they soon had to decide what they were going to do when they entered the Dáil. And it was at this point that difference of opinions arose between O'Donnell and Redmond, with O'Donnell more inclined to want to give vigorous opposition, whereas Redmond was more inclined to give cautious support, or a constructive opposition at least, to the government. However, such difficulties were soon swept to one side with the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins in July 1927. And it was at this point then that the seeds of what was quite an unlikely coalition began to emerge, as Labour was very uneasy about the legislation introduced by the government in the aftermath of O'Higgins' assassination, which would necessarily force abstentionist TDs like Fianna Fáil to either take their seats or to stand aside. And the National League, although it was at odds with Labour on a lot of policy issues, shared this unease. So moves were afoot between Labour and Fianna Fáil to circumvent the government in some way and to try to form a coalition. And the parliamentary arithmetic that was produced by the June election meant that if Fianna Fáil took their seats, Cumann na Gael would no longer command a majority. So eventually the National League was approached, and Redmond and O'Donnell weren't inhospitable, provided that Fianna Fáil was only a silent partner and there would be a Labour National League coalition. However, such efforts were to end in failure and in some degree a farce. It would have meant, of course, that 9 years after the Irish Party's famous defeat, you could have had Redmond's son as Minister for External Affairs and Tom O'Donnell as Attorney General. However, when a motion of no confidence was set up in W.T. Cosgrave, one of their TDs wouldn't vote for it, and another who was expected to, John Jinks, I have a rare poster for him here from the National Library's collection, was famously or perhaps infamously absent. And this resulted in a tie in Leinster House, and the government survived on a cast-in vote. Now, I won't get into all the stories around the reasons for John Jinks' absence. There's numerous accounts. I will say that after the event, Jinks very much defended it as him representing the desires of his constituents. And it's worth pointing out he did remain a local representative through the fall of the Home Rule Party, through this period, and into the mid-1930s when he later joined Fine Gael. So he argued that his supporters could never countenance a deal with De Valera and that he was representing them, whatever other stories might have arisen from his absence. In any case, the National League suffered very badly for this attempt at government. It was portrayed as opportunistic, they suffered a lot of attacks, and in the aftermath, they tried to defend themselves. So O'Donnell and Redmond wrote a letter saying that they were responsible for getting Fianna Fáil into the Dáil, and that they owed it to the electorate to avail of the first opportunity to remove Cumann na Gael. However, a snap election was called 3 months later in September, and the bad publicity and the backlash from this move, and it must be said a lack of funds, because they hadn't been able to fundraise in the way that they needed to, meant that they could only stand 6 candidates in September and only won 2 seats, Redmond in Waterford and Coburn in Louth. Over the following years then, this effort to revive the Irish Party was almost at an end, and people like Redmond, Coburn and O'Donnell had to wind up with what effectively was a bankrupt party and choose where to put their political affiliation in the late 1920s and heading into the 1932 election. At this point then, many former Home Rule activists began to join Cumann na Gael. Often it was an unenthusiastic conversion, but many felt that the moves of De Valera and Fianna Fáil and what they perceived as their disastrous determination not to honour the land annuities was as much a betrayal of the old Irish Party land legislation as it was of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. However, O'Donnell and a number of others took a more distinctive path. O'Donnell began to head in the direction of Fianna Fáil and demonstrate what I think was the more radical tradition that had always existed in what was a very broad-based Home Rule movement. For example, in late 1927, O'Donnell wrote to one of his former ex-MP's colleagues that he felt the National League members would form a good blend and directing force with the Fianna Fáil members. And he scorned the fact that Cumann na Gael was now working not just with ex-Home Rulers, but ex-Unionists like Major Brian Cooper. And as time passed, then O'Donnell began to write for the Fianna Fáil newspaper The Nation. He began to move towards De Valera's position of retaining the annuities. And he also remained in tune with Hibernians in Monaghan, who, unlike the majority of former Home Rule activists, had moved towards support for Fianna Fáil. The AOH published his pamphlet, The Partition of Ireland, where he criticised the treaty and partition, arguing the Irish Party had never conceded permanent partition. And his criticism of the British government, too, was also striking, where he complained that they had demanded little in way of financial contribution from Northern Ireland and had effectively made partition permanent. Heading into 1932 then, the historian Brian Reynolds has argued that the absorption of former Home Rulers in Cumann na Gael helped to damage the party and helped to, in many ways, solidify Fianna Fáil's nationalist credentials. And I think there's one famous cartoon here from the Irish press, which I think is quite catching because it shows Cumann na Gael as a patient in the bed, and Captain Redmond there is giving it a transfusion to Cumann na Gael, which is portrayed as a stricken patient. And it's seen as the last resort for Cumann na Gael to absorb these former Home Rulers. However, there was also a sense to which Fianna Fáil wasn't afraid to absorb former Home Rulers like O'Donnell and the former Galway MP James Cosgrave too, in the sense that they could then portray themselves as having absorbed the better part of the Home Rule Party compared to what Cumann na Gael were absorbing. O'Donnell even contested a seat for Fianna Fáil in 1932. His electoral chances had suffered in 1927 because he contested a constituency which didn't have as strong a legacy of Irish Party support as the border counties of the South East. And in many ways it seems extraordinary he didn't head for a border constituency, I think, in 1932 for Fianna Fáil. He didn't contest Monaghan, where he had given a number of speeches. There was some discussion with Sean Lamass of him contesting Donegal, but I think the Radio na Gaeltacht documentary I mentioned earlier accounted that there seemed to be a reluctance to put him into Donegal opposite the Blaney machine. His name went forward for a constituency convention in Louth, but ultimately he would stand in Dublin County. And O'Donnell ended up standing on a very strong Fianna Fáil ticket in Dublin County, alongside Sean McEntee, Sean Brady, Pádraig Ó Máille and Richard Duke. And this again would dent his chances of being elected on such a strong Fianna Fáil ticket. However, it didn't mean that he wasn't a prominent speaker on the electoral campaign, and he managed then to try to appeal to former Home Rule voters for Fianna Fáil. For example, he said that Fianna Fáil represented the highest traditions of Irish nationalism, and that he again repeated the argument that the National League had helped the country towards reunion by helping Fianna Fáil's passage into the Dáil Éireann. Fianna Fáil was of course returned to power then in 1932, and O'Donnell wouldn't contest election again, despite repeated rumours that he would contest the 1933 election for Fianna Fáil. What he did, however, was advise De Valera on the land annuities question, and along with another former Home Rule MP, Henry Harrison, Harrison and O'Donnell were used by De Valera as advisors on the land annuity issue. They were used as people who could help out with other associations and organisations. For example, when the National Farmers and Ratepayers League stood up for cattle farmers against the policies of Fianna Fáil in the 1930s, O'Donnell ended up as the head of a rival farmers' organisation, the United Farmers Protection Association, which supported the government's policy on protectionism and the annuities. And indeed, O'Donnell took an increasingly hard-line position on the economic war with Britain, arguing that not a single article manufactured in England should be allowed into this country except under licence, while the trade dispute continued. O'Donnell too was called to the bar in 1932, and although he would never again stand for election, he served as a circuit court judge in Clare, Kerry and Limerick in 1941. He became successful, respected and very much part of an independent Ireland, which so many of his colleagues would have viewed with incomprehension and wariness just as recently as 1922-23. So to come to some conclusion, I'll leave you with one last table of TD, some home rule backgrounds in Fine Gael from its foundation up to 1944. And you'll see that a significant tranche of Fine Gael TDs had some form of a home rule background, whether it was the explicit former MP, or more likely sometimes sons or daughters of MPs, or former councillors or guardians. And this kind of a legacy wasn't visible in Fianna Fáil. Perhaps ironically, given that many scholars would argue that Fianna Fáil better replicated the old Home Rule party's organisational drive and discipline better than Cumann na Gael had. O'Donnell then, in some ways, might be seen as different to a lot of his former colleagues or former people in his network. But he was not unique in his path or in his contribution to public life in independent Ireland. For example, Honor Crowley was a TD for South Kerry for Fianna Fáil, and she was the daughter of John Pius Boland, who was the Home Rule MP for South Kerry. Patrick Lynch is another noteworthy example. Defeated in the 1917 by-election by De Valera, he would later serve as Attorney General with De Valera. Although O'Donnell missed out on this role in 1927, the National League held a significant, if brief, position in politics as it stood on the edge of forming a unique coalition government with Labour and Fianna Fáil. After the League's fall, many former local notables moved into the backbenches and sometimes front benches of Cumann na Gael and Fine Gael. However, if we think back to the Home Rule era, the rhetoric of the party and its leaders could often vary depending on location and on audience. And many supporters of the party had not been necessarily doctrinaire in their demand for self-government. And this lack of fixed ideals could encompass MPs who would have encountered a more imperial vision, such as that articulated by Redmond in later years, or indeed an affinity for Irish Ireland, the GAA and the Gaelic League, which made somebody like Tom O'Donnell feel instinctively at home in Fianna Fáil. In contrast, what some former Home Rule supporters would perceive as fanaticism in pursuit of the Republic, or fanaticism in terms of the Civil War or 1916, would have led them very wary to join the Fianna Fáil party. This comes back to one of the National League's greatest weaknesses when it tried to revive the Irish party. It had tried to recapture the essence of what had constituted the politics of a very broad-based nationalist movement. And I think it's perhaps ironic then that once the National League had faded away, the arc of O'Donnell's remarkable career highlights the full spectrum of opinion which had existed within the wider Home Rule movement. Thank you.
Gee, Vaginusla, agus is more an honor a bheith an shot in you, so gan buchas do murish agus mora agus gacile dinna hug on Curadum. I'm going to begin with an apology because this paper has very much a national focus, with just some examples from County Kerry, but there will be some. It has always seemed something strange to me that the class which experienced most revolutionary change in Ireland in the 20th century is the class that has probably attracted least attention from historians of the period 1919 to 1923, namely the aristocracy stroke gentry. And indeed, their revolutionary experience began in the late 1870s when the land war and the rise of Irish nationalism coincided, so that by the beginning of the Great War, both their social and political lives had been transformed utterly. 1919 to 1923 was the final episode, so to speak, when the aristocracy and gentry experienced a degree of intimidation probably unknown in their living memory. And back in 2001, I looked at a remarkable phenomenon of this, i.e. the burning of country houses, 300 of which were burned throughout the country between 1920 and 1923. And at the time, I was very much dependent upon newspaper and police reports generated at the time of the burnings themselves. And I drew from those very broad conclusions about the motivations for this destruction. Houses were burned because they were to be offered as temporary barracks to the Crown forces, as reprisals for the attacks on the homes of IRA and Sinn Féin supporters by Crown forces, because their owners showed themselves to be too openly supportive of the British administration in Ireland, and most especially because of local land questions around the acquisition and redistribution of the main and untended lands. And not forgetting that for many Republicans, of course, these were the ultimate physical symbol of all that they wanted to destroy with regard to colonial representation in Ireland. And these type of motivations could be ascribed to houses in Kerry such as Glen Bay, Ballyhaig and Derreen. But in more recent years, there has been a release of a whole range of news sources that has led me to realise that the more information available, the more difficult it is to unravel interlocking historical and contemporaneous reasons for the destruction of historical houses. So we have to understand the circumstances, not just at the time of the burnings themselves, but historical conditions as well. So it might seem that the reason for a burning of a local big house is because it was about to be taken over by the auxiliaries or the Black and Tans or whatever. But unless we investigate fully, we probably lose sight of other motivations that were present, whether they were agrarian or related to ancestral grievances, and so on. Now, the sources, the same sources that I've just referred to, have also made possible a more complete investigation of many associated consequences of destruction, most particularly the loss of contents due to looting, which is what I want to focus on this morning in this short presentation. And I'm going to do so for the extended period from 1879 up to 1923, simply because no one has really looked at this dimension of revolution before. Looting, loosely defined, is the indiscriminate theft of goods and has been an integral part of war and revolution from time immemorial. Genghis Khan, for example, said, "To vanquish your enemies, to rob them of their wealth, was the greatest source of satisfaction." But of course, looting also describes the removal of historical artifacts from one country to another. And this was very prevalent in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, as British and Irish aristocrats plundered from Italy to Egypt. Illicit trafficking in cultural... Sorry. Oh yeah, there we go. And of course, illicit trafficking in culture and artefacts from Ireland was not unknown. And this cartoon from the Diamond magazine of the 7th of April 1883 shows someone escaping from the Royal Irish Academy with a bag of loot, clearly marked Irish art treasures, and handing them over to his fellow conspirator in the Royal Dublin Society, much to the chagrin of the policeman representing public opinion. The RDS was connected with the South Kensington Museum, for which the loot, it seems, was destined. But the date is significant because it coincides with what might be termed the lawful dispersal of Irish country house collections as a result of the passing of the Settled Land Act of Ireland the previous year, 1882. Now, this hugely important but little known piece of legislation allowed indebted landlords to sell family heirlooms, and it was passed as a goodwill gesture to Irish landlords whose rental incomes had been diminished as a result of the fair rent fixing terms of the 1881 Land Act. So for decades after 1883, paintings and other treasures disappeared from Ireland to make their way across the Atlantic to adorn the homes or indeed lie permanently in the storage vaults of rising plutocratic American families such as the Vanderbilts, the Mellons, Rockefellers, Hearsts, and so on, whose agents, some no better than looters themselves, had swarmed around Irish country houses like vultures around decaying carcasses. And in 2015, the Ireland Crossroads of Design exhibition in the Art Institute of Chicago was a sobering reminder of what had been lost. This exhibition alone featured 300 paintings and objects that had once adorned Irish big houses, but now in private American collections. After the passing of the 1882 Settled Land Act, libraries were often the first to go. In 1884, the Great Library at Gosford Castle was sold to cover the fourth Earl's debts. And while outside our chronological span, but informative, is the story of the Clandeboy Library. In the spring of 1928, Shane Leslie of Glaslaw wrote to Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach, the celebrated rare book dealer, of, and I quote, "virgin libraries panting for a seducer in Ireland." And Rosenbach was told by Leslie that the Marquis of Dufferin had an urgent need for cash that made him desirous of selling his books. The library, he said, represented a rich harvest of original manuscript poems and presentation copies from such writers as Dickens, Thackeray, and Tennyson. The whole estate was entailed. So Dufferin, it is alleged, simply told Leslie he would be out of a given evening and wouldn't notice what would be gone the following day. And this proved merely an aperitif, and so it was off to Caledon next, where Leslie tells us no unleashed greyhound ever bounded faster after rabbit than the portly Dr. Rosenbach rushed to the books. And these included Bishop Percy's annotated copy of the first folio of Shakespeare, and also the twin of the famous collection of 1619 Shakespearean quartos. So therefore, British Land Acts passed for Ireland not only led to the break-up of estates, but also the sale of houses and the dispersal of contents. No one has yet carried out an audit of how many country houses were sold or simply abandoned after the sale of estates, especially the Wyndham Land Act of 1903. But, for example, when George Moore visited Mayo in 1911, he found in that county alone that a Tye Valley house was empty, Brown Hall had physically disappeared, Balnafad was a monastery, Cornfield was empty and about to be demolished, the Knoxes were gone from Craigor, Newbrook was sold and demolished, and so on. So throughout the country, there must have been scores, if not hundreds, of such examples of owners who left Ireland and took with them their collections. But amongst those who stayed was the Leslie family at Glaslaw, now Castle Leslie. And in 1914, they used their Wyndham Land Act money to electrify the house. And one of the sons, Seymour, wrote at the time to his brother, "The electric light was switched on at Glaslaw last week for the first time. Interesting discoveries of old masters and priceless books soon followed in consequence." Unquote. But the resettlement of the estate, following Shane's conversion to Catholicism and nationalism, followed soon after by the death of the second son, Norman, at the front in 1914, meant the electric light had merely shown up what had to be sold in order to meet taxes and debt duties. And similarly, in August 1915, Major William Fortescue Garston, only son and heir of John Ribden Garston of Bragginstown in Louth, was killed in action. His father, the only male member of the family surviving in the county, died 2 years later. And in 1918, the entire contents of the Garston Library at Bragginstown were sold to meet debt duties. Similarly, in 1917, Lord Courtown had to sell paintings from his Wexford home to pay debt duties of £1,800. In 1919, for a similar reason, furniture was sold from Shelton Abbey in County Wicklow for £3,500. And this particular impact of the Great War in Ireland has also received very little attention. From the 1920s the columns of the Irish Times were flooded with notices advertising the sale of very superior furniture, oil paintings and engravings, rare Irish books, and Irish silver plate and antiquities. And in June 1920, as the War of Independence intensified in Westmeath, just to take one example, the contents of Killua Castle were sold, including Holbein's portrait of Gustavus Vasa, Kneller's William III, Rembrandt's Samson threatens his father-in-law, Caravaggio's Death of Seneca and Alexander and Diogenes, and Cuyp's portrait of the artist's wife. The auction catalogues of Bennett and Son showed that by 1920, owners such as Charles Monk, Lord Massey, Charles Hamilton and so on had sold paintings by Gainsborough, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Bruegel, Werner, Kneller and so on, as well as huge quantities of silver, Chippendale furniture and rare books. Now it's not clear if these auctions were brought about by the growth of revolutionary activity and because owners had simply made up their minds that Ireland held no future for them. But my guess is that economic necessity was just as great a determining factor. Those who burned country houses during the War of Independence and the Civil War were usually thorough in what they did. Typically, a gang of armed men arrived at a house, offered the family or whoever was in residence 15 to 30 minutes to remove what they could, and then they piled the furniture in the middle of rooms, sprinkled it with paraffin and set it all alight. And this way, houses were reduced to ruins and contents destroyed. So there may be a lot of truth in what Lady Fingal later said. Often it was valueless things that were stacked on the lawn to be examined when the cold light of day broke on the blackened walls and ashes, while the Romneys and the Chippendale furniture and Waterford glass or old Irish silver had perished. But on the other hand, some owners were more prepared than others. Elizabeth Bowen, for example, tells us that around 1920, the family portraits left the house in a hurry, for the first time for a sojourn in a cottage at the end of the woods. Other valuables followed them. The Republicans came in to meet cautious faces, empty cabinets and bare walls. Lord Donnelly of Kilby in Tipperary stored contents in the local bank in Neenah and sent more important collections to banks in Dublin. Sir Thomas Esmond of Ballynastrawn, Wexford, negotiated storage space in the National Gallery. In some cases, Rembrandts and Rubenses were the last thing on a family's mind. When Castleshane was destroyed in Monaghan in 1920, almost the entire contents, including a very rare famine archive, were burned. But yet all the family members inquired about was whether the only painting of their father had survived. While young Jack Lucas Scudamore, still on naval duty after the Great War, wondered if the gramophone had pipped it and had his records been melted. So we can sometimes forget that these mansions were first and foremost family homes. So when Castleshane was abandoned, the steward reported a few days later that the remaining portion of the castle had been broken into by locals and curtains and clothes stolen. The domain was pillaged, trees were cut down, and people pulled up evergreen shrubs by the root to set in their own gardens. And similarly, the night after Kilby and Tipperary was burned, the conservatory, garden out offices and farmyard were all looted and all the farm machinery taken. The raiders also took clocks and bicycles, ladies' hairpins and blankets. Landlords, including Lord Lansdowne here in Kerry, who sought protection from the provisional government when their properties came under such attack, were often disappointed by the response. In 1922, H.P. Maxwell, Lansdowne's agent, wrote on numerous occasions to the Minister for Home Affairs deploring the state of lawlessness around the Reen. By May 1922, he claimed that the Reen had been looted a number of times, the adjoining garage commandeered and used as a dance hall, the woods and lands overrun with trespassing cattle. No efforts were made to investigate Maxwell's complaints. and the Reen was eventually burned in late 1922. The difficulty of separating national and local political and agrarian motives is very well illustrated in a Garda report, when a local sergeant wrote to the Minister for Home Affairs, the offenders were Republicans and Free Staters in about equal proportions and acting on no mandate but their own. And 3 days later, Maxwell, the agent, visited the Reen, and this is his description of what greeted him. On arrival at the Reen, the scene that greeted our eyes beggars description. Crowds of every description around the house, men, women and children, pulling, hauling, fighting for what they could take. The house is absolutely destroyed. Doors all smashed, every particle of furniture taken. A, who is unidentified, tried to save a few things, but as fast as he and his men got them out, they were seized and carried off. On Saturday and Sunday night, A says it was perfect hell. They got out the cellars and the men were all half drunk, fighting and revolver shots going off. Everything is gone. All the windows, doors, floorings, etc. have been taken. The motor garage is gone. A's house burned to the ground. All outbuildings either removed or burnt. Greenhouses smashed up. Laundry pulled down and removed. Joss's house looted and walls only remain. In fact, there is nothing left of the Reen or its surroundings. So the impression we get from such reports is that local looters didn't come in search of Rembrandts or Romneys. When Castle Saunderson in Cavan was abandoned by its owner, it became a sort of Tom Tiddler's ground for the countryside. Baths, we are told, and fireplaces, water pipes, doors, windows, and fittings of all descriptions vanished like magic. Even the lead from the roof was stripped off and stolen. So locals came in search of what was of some practical value to them. After all, we might ask, what did Rembrandt or Gainsborough or Constable or Romney or anybody else mean to a small farmer's son or an agricultural labourer, typically the IRA volunteer? Lady Adair of Glenveigh in Donegal may have been disgusted by the IRA man who stuck a pencil in her oil portrait of Lord Kitchener, but the action fully illustrated what the piece of art meant to him. In August 1922, the anti-treatyites occupied Mitchelstown Castle in Cork, and a witness later recalled that in one apartment I saw some men who were intently sketching a map of the surrounding district on the back of a massive oil painting, and that the beautiful library has been cleared of its valuable contents to provide material to barricade the windows. So again, there was no appreciation for what might be termed an alien culture. In the same way that it is often difficult to distinguish between IRA arsonists and local agrarian agitators, it's equally difficult to distinguish between IRA and civilian looters. And this was summed up by Justice Devitt following the looting of Glenfarne in County Leitrim. They are closely knit bands, he wrote, often little differing from bandits, under local leaders whose names have gained a reputation much like that of some robber chief of the storybooks. It is often hard to tell where the political outlaw ends and the looter begins. But of course, there were more discerning and culturally sophisticated looters who knew that profit was to be made from social chaos. One might include in this local elites, the bank managers, solicitors, auctioneers, who sold and bought house contents of beleaguered owners and then inhabited their houses themselves. Charles Laverty, pictured here, Castleblaney solicitor, who unsuccessfully had contested the 1910 general election in Monaghan as a home ruler, took up residence in Lochbawn House after the Free State Army had vacated it in 1923. And this is General Dan Hogan sitting in front of the house about 1922 or so, brother, of course, of Mick Hogan of Bloody Sunday fame. No money or deeds changed hands, and the Tennyson family had to buy Lochbawn back after Laverty's death. Rathmile House in Offaly was bought by the auctioneer who had previously auctioned its contents. And there's also plenty of anecdotal evidence of Republicans looting artworks and other treasures and selling them to antique dealers along the Dublin quays, and these in turn being purchased by professionals and merchants strangely incurious about their provenance. Decades after the Revolution, Justice James Murnahan's niece recollected how he had managed to amass a collection of 1,200 paintings in his Fitzwilliam Street home, many of them old masters bought from shops on the Dublin quays in the 1920s that had once been hung in big houses, and she admitted that he had never inquired about their provenance. So by the spring of 1923, looting had reached crisis point. When Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Home Affairs, was interviewed, he admitted, owing to the activities of the last 10 months, there were people who had got rich quick and were in possession of property to which they had not a scrap of legal title. He told his cabinet colleagues that Free State soldiers, and I quote, had reported that some houses which they searched were crammed with loot and resembled Tutankhamun's tomb. They found hens roosting on valuable oil paintings, and silver articles were scattered over the floor. This, O'Higgins believed, didn't augur well for the credibility of the new Irish Free State and could be damaging to its international credit rating. And thus he was instrumental in setting up military courts to try people for a variety of offences, including looting, arson, destruction, seizure, unlawful possession or removal of or damage to any public or private property. I've yet to find a case of someone found guilty of looting a country house, but Thomas O'Connell, for example, was given 10 years penal servitude for looting a train at Neenah in September 1922. In 1923, the Free State government passed a Compensation Act intended to compensate those who had lost property during the Civil War. The government was never going to be generous in compensating country house owners. Of course, a bankrupt state couldn't afford to be, but a note on the draft of the 1923 Compensation Bill by President W.T. Cosgrave suggests there were other factors. Practically every claim for financial accommodation, it said, to economic interest is accompanied by a statement from loyalists that the government can find millions to compensate a class which never benefited the nation and drew its revenues from rents and lands, etc., etc. Now, in the case of collections and furniture, in order to get compensation, it had to be proved that those who stole them had been engaged in or purporting to act, or who might reasonably be presumed to have been acting in the name or on behalf of any combination or conspiracy for the overthrow of the provisional government. When Lord Donnelly's claim for compensation for the loss of contents at Kilby was dismissed by the County Court judge in May 1924, his solicitors wrote to him, "We were unable to prove that the things were taken by the irregulars, and as a matter of fact, I believe they were not taken by these people, for the whole place was plundered principally by the mountainy people of Silver Mines after the burning." And Donnelly was advised to leave well enough alone and not to seek the restitution of his contents. Furthermore, judges were instructed to take into consideration the steps taken or which might reasonably have been taken by the owner of the property, his servant or agents, to protect the property. Because very many houses were vacant, the Morning Post was right to point out in April 1923 that the loyalist owner having to leave the country to save his life may be deprived altogether of compensation by the judge for failing to take steps to protect the property from an injury he could anticipate. So in conclusion, we'll probably never know the true extent of loss to looting from 1879 to 1923, or from 1919 to 1923, and so on. I mean, did paintings and other valuable objects adorn farmhouses and Irish cottages for generations, no one aware of their provenance and true value? Did owners retrieve all of their valuable contents, put into storage for safekeeping, kept in local banks and national institutions such as the National Gallery? In March of this year, former Bank of Ireland official Jim Connolly revealed to the Irish Times that he had seen huge paintings and other artefacts housed in pallets, travel chests, suitcases and trunks. And following Connolly's evidence to the Joint Committee on Rural and Community Development on the 6th of March 2019, Deputy Eamon O'Keefe claimed that opening the vaults would show some beautiful items that have been hidden away. There is probably, he said, a Caravaggio, a Rubens or something else there. Is he right? Connolly has asked all members to support an amendment to the Dormant Accounts Act to place an obligation on banks to give back property that has been held in safekeeping on behalf of deceased Irish citizens. So future developments will undoubtedly be interesting, for it probably means that in the meantime, just as the Irish Land Commission refuses open access to its archives, the banks will close up shop on this subject, because to open our archives would be to reveal a history that some obviously prefer to keep hidden. Thank you.
Just for the both of you, there was a TD from West Cork called Jasper Wolfe, who was a Crown solicitor in the British establishment and got 3 death threats from the IRA, and he represented many of the people who threatened him subsequently in the Civil War. But he was a member of the Dáil subsequently in 1923. He remained an independent. Was he involved with that movement? Did he take part in that grouping? He was anti-Irish or compulsory Irish at the time.
Yeah, Jasper Wolfe is an interesting one because he had been a Protestant Home Ruler, and as you said, he had quite an active role during the years 1919 to 23. And he reinvents himself as an independent TD in West Cork, but he seems to have a facility to appeal to a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different political creeds. So the answer is O'Donnell and Redmond, they approach him and they ask him to join, but he has little enough interest, and he says it on a couple of grounds. For one, there's an association, he said, with the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which in Cork was very much associated with factionalism and national politics. So he saw that people in West Cork in particular, who would have remembered the old rows between Hibernians and Redmondites and followers of William O'Brien, would have seen it as a revival of that kind of factionalism. And secondly, he says simply that he'd do better as an independent. So he remains independent.
And was it true that he plied Mr. Jinks with drink and got him on the train back to the West to avoid him being involved in that vote?
Well, as I said, Jinks himself denied that story, but he's one of those that recurs in stories. Him and Bertie Smiley from the Irish Times is normally mentioned as well. And, I think Brian Cooper normally gets a mention in those stories. Yeah.
And the final thing is that he lived in a place in Skibbereen called Norton House, and around 1922, a couple of young fellas who were Republicans visited it and said that they were going to burn it down. They spoke at the door to his wife, and she went into a panic and she called him out, Jasper Wolfe, and he brought them into the study and he said, we'll give her a little bit of time to take out a few valuables. And meanwhile he opened the whiskey bottle and plied them for 2 or 3 hours, and by the time they left they couldn't light a match, not mind Norton House. So he used his noggin.
Actually, that's an interesting story that I might like to use at some stage, because while there were 300 big houses burned, that means there was only about 10% of those in existence in the country at one stage destroyed. And I've been trying to basically figure out why the rest weren't touched. Now, there's a myriad of reasons for them. But local stories are the most important, like that one. Or not the most important, but the most interesting. I mean, Carton House in Maynooth, for example, the IRA were said to have been brought to a portrait of Lord Edward that hangs still to this day in Carton, and told that this was the father of Irish republicanism and this was his ancestral home, to which they bowed in deference and left. Now, fine story, but you hear the same story for about a dozen other country houses in the area. But my favourite is Castlehyde in Cork, which is said to have been a safe house for the IRA during the War of Independence, and that Michael Collins frequently used it, coming across the old Victorian bridge at the top of the garden into the back of the house, and that he was having an affair with one of the local maids. Of course, if you look at the dates, Collins was never in the area at any stage around that time. But there was a Collins in the house who was the caretaker, right? So the two characters have become one. Yeah.
Was there a relationship between Mr. O'Donnell and Dermot Kendon, the former High Court judge?
Yes, he's Father Gahan can probably say more, because I think he worked closely with him when he was writing his book. But he was his grandson.
Yes, Jerry. Dermot was the grandson of Tom O'Donnell, and he commissioned me to write the biography.
As somebody whose ancestors were blacksmiths to a number of the great houses and great estates in the United Kingdom, particularly to Shugborough House, which is a wonder if any of you have seen it. But I think one of the great tragedies of the revolutionary years in Ireland was the destruction of the houses and of the treasures. But talking about the stuff being taken by the locals, I recall I was reared by people who were very, very old, and I heard all the stories, but I heard one particular story, and it was about when Ballincollig Barracks was burned, and the parish priest in our parish of Inniscarra, which is across the river, 5 miles across the river, warned everybody under pain of mortal sin at each of the masses on the morning that they were not under any circumstances to go and loot Ballincollig Barracks. The problem was nobody in the parish of Inniscarra knew that the barracks had been burned. But that evening there wasn't a donkey, cart, wheelbarrow or horse in the parish of Inniscarra. And we had two items in our house. We had a last, you know, for fixing your shoes, which held the door open, and that came from there. And we had, you probably never heard this term, we had a thing called a graphon. A graphon, which was kind of a mix of a hoe and a pickaxe, right? And it was wonderful. And if I had it today in my garden, I would be absolutely charmed, right? But nearly every home in the parish had items that were stolen under pain of mortal sin.
Thank you very much. Just remains for me to thank Dr. Martin O'Donoghue and Professor Dooley for their splendid lectures, and to thank you for your kind and courteous attention. Thank you.
Just again to remind you that the library will now be closed. We'll be reopening at 2:15. Those of you who've already registered can just flash this when you come in and there'll be no problem. Those of you who want to have lunch, there are any number of fine restaurants back that way. The Fertha restaurant, QC's, the Hungry Monk, there are all kinds of places. So we won't want for a place to eat. So we'll see you at 2:15 or 2:30. Thank you very much.